Yeah, what do you feel extra seen being?
The Lutheran between two thorns.
Between two roses.
Let me start by again thanking you all for bearing with us. We're slightly behind, but my good friend Reverend Brian Weis is going to kick us right off.
All right.
After you.
Hello. Yes, this is Paganism and Monotheism. I'm going to set down some ground rules first, so make certain I get these correct. Ben, if you would. First, no kicking, no biting. Kicking is permitted as long as you don't kick down. Oh wait, I'm sorry. That was the Catholicism versus Lutheran chat. That's a different one. Thank you for the loan of that joke, Ben. Yeah. No, okay, yes, of course. This is Paganism and Monotheism. This is, what, the second or third in the series of your dialogues?
The third? Oh, it is a third.
It is a third. Because one was a parliament.
One was a parliament, one was just before that.
That's right, yeah, the parliament prep.
2021.
Right. So they should be seasoned pros by now. I was not either one of those, so I am not a seasoned pro. I'm gonna do my best to keep up with them. So, I am Reverend Brian. I'm an interfaith minister and a heathen, but that will not influence me against our good friend Andrew here. Okay, yes. I'll let each one of you introduce yourselves and where you're from, please.
My name is Reverend Ethan Stark.
There's a microphone there, buddy.
I forgot. My apologies. Hello. I am Reverend Ethan Stark. I am from Appleton, Wisconsin. I am currently the clergy coordinator for the Troth, an inclusive heathen organization. I am also one of the administrators for Heathens Against Hate, and most recently the chair of the pagan chapter in the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy.
Thank you for joining us again, Andrew.
My name is Andy Behrendt. I do technical support at my church, and I also am a Lutheran pastor at that church. I am from Wapaka, Wisconsin, not far from where Ethan is these days. We were real close together for a little window of time back in 2021 when we got this started. I have been at Trinity Lutheran Church, an ELCA congregation in Wapaka for 13 years, and this is kind of a cool thing to be here. Thank you for being here.
Yes. All right, so I was asked to basically compile some questions for these two. And so I've compiled some on my own. I also reached out and had people submit questions. I'm going to try to make certain I credit where those questions come from when I can, when I'm allowed to. Some of them are anonymous, okay? But this one to kick off with will also kind of help with your introductions and backgrounds, okay? So, a chaplain based in Kansas, I'm allowed to say that, but a chaplain based in Kansas asks, what was the deciding factor for conversion, if you were not born or raised in your tradition, okay? Or the factor for staying in a tradition, if that's one you grew up in. So basically, why that religion? And they further stipulated just choose one deciding factor, but we know that doesn't always work, so if you need more than one, please give us those factors.
Without going into too much of the history or whatnot, I was raised a Reformed Jew back in Israel, and by the age of 13, as teenagers would, tried to figure out themselves. And I remember going to synagogue. I think it had to have been for Day of Atonement, because there was a lot of standing up and sitting down, which I already didn't like. But I looked at the chazan, I looked at the cantor, and then I looked at the rabbi who was sitting next to him. And as much as I enjoyed listening to a lot of the songs that were sung in synagogue, I always kind of looked at those two and I was like, why are you there and why am I down here? I feel like you're closer to God than I am. And my view has shifted since then, but that was a formative impression that was laid in my mind, and so I started searching for a more personal relationship with God. And I entered into the quote-unquote gateway earth-centered spirituality, which was Wicca at the time, circa 1997. And as much as that informed me a lot about paganism as a whole, I wasn't satisfied yet because I still needed more structure, and a lot of things felt too eclectic, too disorganized in my opinion, in my view, and I didn't find it comfortable. So it wasn't until later that I managed to gravitate towards also towards heathenry, which was a very particular tradition of pre-Christian Germanic faith, and the core tenets of that religion, as well as the deities of that religion, very much resonated with me, and it pulled me away. And I recall when I was like 13 years old and I was really into Wicca, my father was like, I have no problem with you exploring so long as it doesn't replace your Judaism. But when he saw that it did, he also saw that this troubled young man that I was at 13 really started to get a lot more grounded because of this faith, because of these pagan elements in his spirituality. And my father then relented because he realized that I'm becoming a better person, a better version of myself.
That's cool. I've never heard that part of the story, I don't think. We're still learning about each other. Mine is pretty simple, and it also involves a dad. My dad was a Lutheran pastor. Grew up in Lutheran congregations in Neenah, Wisconsin, and then just outside of Green Bay, and thankfully my dad was a pretty good parent and a pretty good pastor too. And I got to see the things that he was doing and the way that somebody lived out faith in daily life, and not just him, but also my mom. And probably more important than my folks was the fact that the congregation really seemed to care about me too, which is, I know, an experience that not everyone has had in their faith community growing up, and I'm grateful for that. Long story short, that also kind of leads into how I became a Lutheran pastor myself. So, you know, so much of it was embodied experience. So much of it was, as the Christian faith itself is built on, a human being communicating to me, you know, lots of human beings communicating to me the love of God, and that's it. Yeah, no big conversion story from here or anything. No going against my dad, although I will note that if my dad would have pushed me to be a Lutheran pastor, I'm sure I wouldn't have been. He gave me no nudge in that direction. It just still kind of happened. So.
All right. I've got a big wind-up for this next question, but I forgot to point out that we're not going to have like this discussion part and then a Q&A. So if you want to get some other questions in, we want this to be more interactive. Try to get my attention and we'll get those in, okay? So I just want to put that out there. I'm going to begin this long wind-up here, and you'll see why there's a wind-up. So I got 3 questions from 3 different people, but I'm putting them together because they kind of dig at, if not the same thing, then a similar idea. Naming. So I'm going to have to add a little more preface there. In a previous talk, one of your previous talks, Ethan drew attention to the fact that the early use of the term pagan was in fact derogatory. The whole thing about country bumpkins, because Christianity was an urban phenomenon, it was spreading in the bigger cities, and those who were still tied to the land were clinging to their old beliefs. Remember that part, okay? Now, where's my note? Of course, even the very early Christian movement wasn't named Christian, all right? The Roman government used that name as a derogatory descriptor for the followers of the way of Yeshua. So it was only later on that the Christians took on that name and rehabilitated it, all right? So we have actually 2 names that were derogatory, all right? I don't know if that part was pointed out in that discussion there, but here we go. These are the questions then that are so similar. An interfaith minister in PA wants to know what's in a name. An anonymous inquiry was submitted to my online question forum. What does the label you are appearing under? I don't see any labels, sorry. What does the label you are appearing under mean to you? What do you think it means to the other person? And what does the other person's label mean to you? So again, what's in a name? What's in your label? And then, few of you will know this individual, Tom Legier, a spiritual teacher and seeker in the Philadelphia area, similarly ponders, if it is not important for spiritual persons to label themselves, do you think it matters what we call ourselves? Does it matter to our God or our gods? I'm giving you the softball questions first, if you noticed.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to answer all that. That's a lot. Wow. See, we didn't. This is. By the way, this is wonderful because the first two times we did this, we had some human beings in the room. The first time they were almost entirely Lutherans from my congregation. The second time it was completely sterile. It was entirely online, and we had some great questions. But we had no faces to look at, and this is great because there's all kinds of people and. There's no extra pressure at all. Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. And I remember when Ethan was pointing that out about paganism, yeah, Christianity also is a derogatory term, a pejorative term. So what does Ethan's title, pagan, mean to me? I'll tell you this, there's been a trajectory here, and I think at some point I need to interject the story because some of you may have heard this before, but a little over 5 years ago now, Ethan's now wife, Kristen, told me that she was, I think, just recently engaged or thought she was about to get engaged, something like that, around that Christmas time, to Ethan. And Kristen had grown up at my church. I did not know her at the time. I was not there back when she was growing up at Trinity in Wapaka. But she was telling me that her soon-to-be fiance, or recently now labeled fiance, was a pagan, believed in Norse paganism. And I remember sitting in that office and being like, wow. That was very, very new to me. And the only experience I've had, and I think I mentioned this at each of the other two talks, was, just like, I remember this part actually just popped back in my head recently. I remember there was like a historical reenactment day at the museum where my wife was working in Sheboygan at the time, and there was a group of pagans in a tent, and I remember thinking, what are they up to? And then the other one that more recently was in my head there in Wapaka is there was a gentleman, and I still haven't met him. I almost tailed his car one time to see if I could figure out who he was. He had this bumper sticker. You can use that later? Yeah, okay. The bumper sticker said born again pagan. And to me, it was terrifying, right? I'm like, I'm afraid enough of born again Christians, but born again pagans really scared me. So I had all sorts of notions going through my mind about this godless person, or is this like satanic or something? As Christians, most of us have no concept. Certainly in central Wisconsin. By the way, if you want where we are on the Wisconsin map, it's right about there. Also, that's very close to sign language for Jesus, interestingly. But my son unwittingly taught me that. Yeah, isn't that cool?
Do you need a microphone for that sign?
Yeah, you don't need the microphone. You can do it without the mic. Anyway, I had these notions about pagans that I don't think anybody really knew what that meant in my church community, or really in most communities I've been a part of. Then I met Ethan just about getting close to 5 years ago now, something like that. Yeah, it was almost 5 years ago. And I'm like, this guy's really neat. And he's really devoted, and he's really spiritual. And I remember talking to another pastor I knew that I was telling, I think I'm going to do a wedding for a Christian and a Norse pagan, which is what I was calling it at the time. And this other pastor, who I know very well, said to me, seriously? Not about the fact that I was going to do the wedding, it was just like someone really truly believes in that. And I'm like, yes, he absolutely does. And it's really cool. By the time I met Ethan, I realized that not only was I totally misjudged pagans and heathens, for that matter, which is another, I believe, pejorative term originally. but recognized that it actually not only meant a lot to him, but it was guiding his life to do some wonderful things. So it's really been a trajectory as to what that label means to me, and that's come entirely until really your wedding, and then now even more so these last few days from Ethan. So it's been good to meet some others here too. I hope that answers the question.
And I'm not going to be asking about the bumper sticker later. I just remember that part of the story.
Yeah.
All right, so I guess for full disclosure, he was my co-officiant for my wedding, everybody. There you go. I believe the first part of that question was my label. It's funny. Pagan and paganism as a whole, I've always viewed as an overarching term, and there are many traditions, and so it's when someone says pagan or pagan clergy or whatnot. If you're in the pagan community, you want more details. If you're outside of the pagan community, I had no idea that there is such a thing, because even the word clergy is a very charged term, and I've shared a lot of sentiment with folks in the pagan community who very much steer clear from a lot of Christian-oriented or monotheistic terms, more particularly Christian. So when you hear clergy, when you hear reverend, and even now, I've only recently started adopting the prefix of reverend, which in the United States can be associated with a lot of groups, but I still have a little bit of imposter syndrome. So for me, when I use pagan, I use it. I kind of use it very proudly, and when I use the term heathen and specify that, I enjoy it even more, because then it prompts people to question, specifically when it comes to people who are not part of my faith tradition, which in Wisconsin are many. And when I hear, when I met Andy, or especially when Kristen, especially when my wife was creating an introduction with Pastor Andy, before I even met Pastor Andy, the moment I heard pastor, I actually associated that specifically with Southern Baptist or just very second revival evangelical kind of I forgot the name of the faith tradition with the snakes and stuff like that. Pentecostal, thank you. That's the thing that just kind of washed over my vision, and I was a little concerned also because I didn't know how I would be received. I don't know if he would say yes, because my wife is a proud Lutheran Christian, and it was very important for us to have an interfaith marriage to illustrate our interfaith household. And if Pastor Andy would not have officiated my wedding, I have no clue who would. And I'm really happy. I'm really happy to have met Pastor Andy and foster the relationship that we've had. And even after the wedding, the wedding was kind of almost like a catalyst to our discussions, because that kind of planted the seed of kind of cooperation, because he even had to sit down with my good friend Kurt Holman, who was the co-officiant from the heathen side of things, and so he was almost kind of thrusted to work in an interfaith capacity, which he had never done before, at least not with a pagan sense. So he had to learn about paganism, and he had to learn about heathenry all in one. And he was very receptive, no matter the flood of information. So I don't know if I tackled all three of those waves of wound up question, but
I think you missed an important one when you were talking about the wedding. So are there or are there not photos of snakes in your wedding photographs?
Regrettably not.
But you got married in front of an open field, which if you looked really closely at the photos, there might be some snakes back there. I would think maybe, but.
I am satisfied.
Yeah, I don't know if we answered the question, but in my tradition, Jesus never really seems to answer them anyway. He just answers them more questions, so I feel like I've satisfied that. And I also just want to tack on that Kurt, the fellow fisher, wonderful guy, the second pagan I met, really, was interestingly first enticed by the idea of paganism by that same bumper sticker that said "Born Again Pagan." So, yeah, crazy stuff. Yeah, he told me there's this bumper sticker. I've seen that. Yeah, and yeah,
For information.
yeah, and I'll just say too, yeah, Christianity to me is something I was born into, and it took me a long time to realize it was originally a pejorative term, but cool. Similarly, the cross. I mean, terrible thing that we ended up embracing, and but of course that was in the golden era of Christians being persecuted as opposed to persecuting others. So
The golden era. Had to question your definitions there a little bit, I think. Okay. All right, we've got another long wind-up. Okay, I was just going to see if there's another question before I go into a wind-up. Yes?
My question for Pastor. So since meeting here, have you had more interfaith conversations with your own church community?
yeah, thanks. So. Sure. The question was, since meeting Ethan, right? We had, have I had more interfaith conversations in my church? Yeah. So this was another, moment of feeling a little fearful, if not even a little threatened, just as I originally was by paganism and heathen, right? Recognizing that we were going to try to do this talk at Parliament in 2021, and believing in the idea of it enough to go to the church council at my congregation, and then realizing we could do this like warm-up activity in Wapaka for actual people who know me, and then ultimately in my church building. So the council, to my delight, said, "Sure, this sounds great." And then the people who showed up, including people I had judged to be so judgmental that they would hate the fact that their pastor was doing this, were ecstatic, and they had questions for Ethan afterward. And we haven't done that much with it since, unfortunately, but I'm coming back from this experience with all sorts of new fire to continue those conversations. But it was really great for that spark to hit the congregation. And I was going to say one other really great part of that too, but it slipped my mind. But people really were receptive. And it was a really good thing. The one guy that I thought was going to be the most against it, like asked us to do this again. Yeah, it was really, really, really cool. And I'll maybe remember the other part I was going to say, but yeah, go ahead. You're the moderator. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and that is the dialogue that is on YouTube, correct?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's like tiny.cc/pagan and pastor or something like that. Yeah, if you look up pagan and pastor, you'll inevitably find it. There's not that many others. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Not only did my congregation think this was great, but I was kind of worried that like my boss, who's like the bishop of our synod within Wisconsin, that part of Wisconsin, might not like this. And then I had a conversation with her late last year, and totally without prompting, not talking about this at all, she said, "One thing I really want you to do is to continue the interfaith conversation, because that was great and it's something we almost never do." So props to Bishop Andy.
Did you say you saw a hand over here? Was that it?
I'll be back.
Okay. Oh. The question is the context of the word heathen and how Ethan, the heathen, is using it.
Yeah, man, my email is Heathen Stark. It works. I use the term heathen the same as many other heathens that are part of heathenry, which is also in and of itself sort of an umbrella term pertaining to the pre-Christian Germanic paganism. So that can include also true, which is relating to the myths of northern Scandinavia, northern Europe, but there's also continental Germanic practices that have also transferred over here to the United States, such as Urglava, which is part of Pennsylvania Deech culture. So heathen, much like pagan, we were talking about pagan being a pejorative, coming from the Greek paganos, meaning a country outdweller. Heathen comes from, I believe it's Old Norse, meaning people of the
Gothic.
heath. Gothic?
It comes from Gothic.
Okay, thank you, Carl.
There it is.
Comes from the Gothic to mean people of the heath, and the people of the heath were people that were living again in the outside city centers, and so the concept of heathen being godless was used in the same way in a Christian sense is how Christians use pagan as being godless, someone who is not part of the city center, not part of the Christian community. So there was also a talk back in Parliament of 2018 by my colleague Diana Paxton about the using the term heathen as an appropriative as opposed to a pejorative. And a lot of heathens, a lot of people who practice heathenry are proudly calling themselves heathen, in the same way as how I believe we spoke, when we spoke last time, we were talking about Lutheran.
I didn't even know that.
Lutheran, the term Lutheran was a pejorative that was given to the Christians who broke from the Catholic Church by the Pope. I think it was Gregory something or other. And because originally I think Martin Luther wanted it to be evangelical as opposed to Lutheran, but then Lutherans embraced it as much as the early Christians later embraced, the term from, whatever the Romans called you. But yeah, so that's essentially what the term heathen means. And if you navigate pagan circles, when you say heathen, 80% of the time, I'll say, 80% of the time, people will understand it as somebody who follows pre-Christian Germanic paganism. Some people just call themselves heathen because they're more of like as an edgy term of going against the Abrahamic grain, so to speak. But 80% is normally somebody like myself, like Gothic Carl over there, and Brian.
And thus a new nickname was born, Gothic Carl.
Worse.
Yes, please.
So in both of these strands of spirituality, we've seen a usurpation of elements of the faith traditions or the spiritual traditions by the right wing. So Christian nationalism, and I don't know if this is the right term to apply, but neo-pagans who have claimed some of those gods and goddesses and then go out and do violence in the name of these religions. So are there interreligious, interfaith dialogues going on between these types of religions to combat that? And if not, how could that happen? Or where is that happening?
Oh, is there?
Dang, that's a good question.
Yeah. Did everyone get the question okay? All right, great.
The first involvement that I had with Parliament was in 2018 in Toronto, where Reverend Brian and I, along with our colleague Robert Shriver, who is the former president of the Troth, the organization that I belong to, as well as our friend Eric Thorpe-Moscone of Heathens Against Hate, we did a panel on of saving religious iconography from extremists, particularly in a heathen context. Because a lot of extremism, especially white nationalism, utilizes Germanic iconography and symbols within their rhetoric. And a lot of the work that we did with Heathens Against Hate had to do with correcting that information. And the most recent, other than Parliament, was back in 2017, 2016? Was it 2018? There's a heathen organization by the name of the Also True Folk Assembly, which is a white supremacist organization that operates within the realm of heathenry and espouses metagenetics and other such theories that basically in order for you to belong in a Germanic faith, you have to be white. And they buy properties in places around the United States and in recent memory, they recently purchased a new one, but prior to that property that they just purchased in Tennessee, they purchased a church in Murdoch, Minnesota. And between myself, my good friend Ben, we contacted a grassroots organization down in Murdoch, Minnesota, led by Victoria Guillemard, and we basically took to the streets in protest of this church because the city council was voting whether or not to allow them to inhabit the church. And unfortunately, the vote came that they were absolutely permitted and that it was safe for the community. They were radically misinformed, and when we tried to present them with the facts of this is not just a spiritual organization. I will clarify. Extremist heathens are within the realm of heathenry. I used to say that they were not heathens because I disagreed with their interpretation of the myths of our religious practices, but theologically speaking, they are heathen. Their ideology that they insert has no basis in our lore, in our practice. That is a modern conception. And even Ben was, I believe you were interviewed by CBS or one of those outlets, with a whole sign and everything right on the street. This was still during COVID time, but despite COVID time, Ben drove down, was it 2 hours, 3 hours from the Twin Cities? It was a long way. A long way from the Twin Cities just to be there, to create a presence, to inform people on this. And every religious, every faith tradition has its fringe members. And so for Christianity, as we have seen in recent years, white Christian nationalism is on the rise. And with heathenry, regrettably, it's white supremacy. And ironically, both groups really get along.
I was going to say this, they actually work together sometimes, whether they know it or not. But some of them actively seek each other out.
Yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
I'll just chime in because I knew Ethan was going to be the much stronger speaker to this topic. But unfortunately, on behalf of Christianity these days, it's not just the fringe folks who are a part of the Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism particularly, and we've got some work to do. And even as a denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and by the way, like our presiding bishop who was here on Monday, I try to say evangelical as opposed to evangelical. I think that's intentional that Bishop Eaton and other leaders say it that way. We've really got some work to do. Bishop Eaton, by the way, I did not see her speak on Monday. She left, I think, before we got here, sadly. But she has recently put out statements right on the homepage of the ELCA saying, that we need to address and confront Christian nationalism. And while certainly in central Wisconsin, that is all too prevalent, believing that we're a Christian nation and, to heck with anybody else, I do thankfully have some people who have been talking to me at length and been very fired up in my congregation about the fact that we can't exist like this as Christians. So, yeah. Thanks for the question.
For your question, I also want to be certain that Ben gives us the last word on this. For that Murdoch place, wasn't the other decision about letting them go was because the council or the mayor or somebody did not want to deal with a long, protracted lawsuit that might come from them, because they were being threatened with that too.
Yes.
Is that the case? Yeah.
It was the case that there was no imminent threat of a lawsuit, but there was the town lawyer had advised them that one was going to be, you're going to be asking for one if you do this. And they also,
And that's why the lawyer said that. He looked it up.
motivated lawyer on their other side as well. And not to go too fine a point on it, but later on, one of the counselors was interviewed, and I had no idea just how much of white nationalist rhetoric he had taken on board himself. he himself was a Christian, but he was repeating talking points that you hear, such as, well, what is a white nationalist anyway? I think that's just a word people use when they don't want to talk about ideas. Like when people confuse the issue that way. Just to be clear, white nationalist does have a very clear definition. But it was shocking to me how much of that rhetoric that I heard from this group he had personally taken on as a Christian. He was proudly Christian, and he had taken this white nationalist rhetoric on himself. Words that could have come from this group, he was saying. So that was the shocking part.
Thank you for the, over here, I promised you.
Thank you. Some of my questions have already been talked about in a way. I'm talking about a specific population. I'm part of an organization called Monotheistic and Pagan Ministries. So I got a clue, right? We are pagan. We have Druids and Pagans and others. And I think the heathens that I encountered in St. Quentin Sacrism, which is where I volunteer, call themselves Odinists, as opposed to some of them called prostitutes. I'm not sure what the differences are, if any, but that is a place where white nationalism tends to flourish. And we're kind of tiptoeing our way through it. I'm looking for guidance from others. I'm not anybody. I sometimes speak to Christian audience and people that have taught the Christian chaplaincies about paganism, pagan world, and the three derivations that I think are important for Christians, like Christians who I wonder if you can still
To deal with that, yes. Please be, if you haven't already, please be certain to stop by the trophy table upstairs and get Laura's business card so you can find out about the InReach program.
Yeah, I mean, to briefly touch on that, there are several heathen organizations that do a lot of prison InReach in order to combat misinformation. The problem is that organizations such as the Austrian Folk Assembly also do. And the prison system doesn't know the difference or otherwise refuses to acknowledge the difference. And the whole term Odinist, we can, basically, they're talking about something that is kind of the same but kind of different. The term Odinist is very charged to a particular development of heathenry that developed in the early 70s or possibly 60s. That already from the get-go was very
controversial.
I was going to say biologized.
Oh,
the whole, you got to be white in order to belong to this. So that has existed prior to the AFA. So Odinist or Odinism is essentially somebody who belongs to that, and that was popular in the prison system, much as the Aryan Brotherhood and so on and so forth. And prison system being already a marginalized system with very specific tribal groups. You're going to stay with the white folk here, and the Latinos have this corner or whatever, and so you're already segregating. It's already a forced segregated system, and so that system builds upon existing structures, and racist literature is prolific in the system, in that system, as you know. And so we're trying to also combat it by bringing in that information to the prison system, and hopefully adding also books to the library, although that has a whole administrative rigmarole that we're not going to get into right now.
I wanted to mention that the talk you gave about heathens against hate in Toronto, that was videoed. I gave to my in-house chaplain sponsor, who's a Catholic. He circulated it among the chaplains that we can
Oh.
I am very glad to hear that. Thank you very much.
I was glad to have it as a resource, and they're looking to the Lutheran authority, and I don't know about when it comes to heathenry, so thank
Can someone with a mic repeat that for the deaf girl in the back?
What did the deaf girl say?
Oh.
No, I'm kidding.
No, she had mentioned that the video that we had done as a recording of our presentation of Heathens Against Hate back in 2018 in Toronto, she had given over to the chaplain over at the prison that they are circulating that within that prison system to combat the white nationalist and white supremacist literature that is there.
It's always fun with that literature because they make, I'm going to say legitimate for the sake of argument, but they make legitimate organizations jump through so many hoops to get their literature in there. Meanwhile, much of the racist literature is just like flowing through back doors, kitchen staff, what have you. It's like, how did this get here again? But Ben wanted to talk on this.
Well, I just wanted to actually change gears and actually touch on something that your panel talked about yesterday about myths, stories, and just how we move forward together, given the stories we already have about each other.
Yeah.
I grew up ELCA too. The stories that I grew up hearing about Christianity's encounter with pagans was a lot of very scared Christians and a lot of very full lions. These were scary stories that they tell you about, to how Christians were tortured and killed, and the golden age, you put it. But these formative myths of Christian identity around this encounter with paganism, which was negative, right? It was not a good time. And then on the other side, Ethan, I know you and I both talked about this at length, the myths we tell ourselves as pagans about our encounter with Christianity, which is usually a highly mythologized version of the conversion, where it's a lot of violence and torture and killing and forced conversion. So given that we have these stories about one another, how do we move forward and flip the script here so we're not just looking at each other like monsters, basically?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a great question. The talk yesterday, at least as much of it as I got to see and hear on myth, was really great. Brian and Ethan were both panelists on that. Story is such a powerful thing, as I think Brian was saying yesterday, right? You can't change anybody's minds with facts, but you can, change minds with story, and it gets to the heart rather than the brain, right? And that's where real change happens. The Greek term that shows up in the biblical New Testament for Christians of metanoia, or change of mind, right? It comes to mind here because I had a very much that sort of conversion experience in my storyline about what paganism was about upon meeting Ethan. And it's still, that storyline is still changing. I hope not only now, it's good to at least start to not only have that story play out in my own mind differently, but hopefully be a part of that story that changes things. One thing that came to mind just within the last couple of days here at Parliament was how I think so often, and I heard this from some of my own parishioners, right, knowing I was going to talk to a heathen, right, is that, we got to convert this guy, and I think so often, right, even if we can get past the persecution that we've each done to each other at various points in history, right, even just getting through modern times preconceptions about one another. So often we get hooked up on conversion, and what we really need is to add a couple letters and make that conversation, right? Right. I mean, this has been the story for me has been the change of story by way of sharing stories and understanding each other, and I think that's just so important because we have to be able to talk. More importantly, we need to be able to listen. We need to hear those stories in order to change the stories in our own minds and the minds of others around us. And when you look at something like this, nationalism, this a brutal, often racist nationalism, you see the other side joining up and overcoming those differences, which is wild. I have not even really realized that until we're just having this conversation now. But all the more important now for us to be able to bridge those gaps and have those conversations and realize what we have in common rather than, this storyline of being separate and, totally different, theological worlds and practical worlds. So, yeah.
I just want to make a quick comment on this because you were actually asking the question that was on my list. Though I want to add some context to it. Then you're going to come in because you wanted to say on this very same topic. Yeah. So I just wanted to point out that one of our colleagues, when I say our, I am talking about Ethan and Carl and Ben. Richard too. John T. Maynard in 2019, he posted a short story on his Facebook page, and the story was titled "Two Gods Meet in a Bar." And I'm not going to ruin it all for you. If you want to find me later on, I'll help you find the link. But it's Two Gods Meet in a Bar. I believe it's public on his page. If it isn't, I've got a PDF of it saved somewhere. But Jesus and Odin are talking in a bar, each filling each other's drinks. Jesus has a little thing. Odin has a glass of red wine. Odin does a little thing. Jesus has a glass of mead. Okay? And they're both lamenting the fact that their teachings have been perverted and turned hateful. Wow. Okay? They're lamenting that. But then they hear a conversation, a heated conversation in the corner of these two women. And they're like, so I'm not giving it away. Right? They think, so we continue. We can write new stories, and we almost have to write these new stories of dialogue and cooperation to get the interfaith work going. Okay, so I just want to make sure I added that. You wanted to talk on this subject too. Please do.
My name's Brother Patrick Finney. I'm ordained through Oak Spirit Sanctuary, which is a pagan umbrella organization in central Missouri. So we are surrounded by very Christian areas as well. And so for the last 2-3 years, I've been in pagan spaces doing a workshop on the initial steps of coming to terms with Christianity, because so many pagans are coming from a faith tradition with coming to paganism as a result of some very negative experiences that they've had with
Their religious origin.
Right. So they're carrying a lot of different negative emotions with regard to Christianity. And so I try and introduce some ideas for people to consider, and one of them is considering the fact that both around the persecutions, prior to Constantine, the Roman Empire was persecuting Christians. Post-Constantine, the Roman Empire continued to persecute. Once the Orthodox form of Christianity was developed, they continued to persecute non-Orthodox Christians as well. So whether the Roman Empire was being headed by polytheists or monotheists, the common denominator there is not monotheism or polytheism, but imperialism. And so,
good point.
Yeah.
And in the same way, a lot of pagans have this feeling that the egg or the evergreen tree into your home in the wintertime are traditions that were stolen from the pagans by being Christianized, right? Appropriated by the Christians. I encourage people to think of these as underlying folk traditions that are more powerful and more enduring than whatever religion is layered over the top of it, and that we can maybe look at these as shared traditions. That isn't it wonderful that we can all do these things despite our differences? So it's something that connects rather than having these negative feelings of theft and appropriation.
Metaphors be with you.
I'm really thankful to hear that from you, because that has been my biggest sticking point when I'm talking in the pagan community, because a lot of the time there's a lot of pushback, and I've shared this with a few others here in Parliament. I did a podcast, evangelical podcast. They invited me over, and in the background, there's a huge backlash of don't do it. Getting the pagan share at FRD, this is the second time around. The first time it flopped because there was a lot of pushback. That pushback came from the pagan community. because of the fact that there's a lot of mistrust and a lot of hurt there. And this is the reason why Andy and I started having a discussion, why I approached Andy, and it was like, okay, we need to do some reconciliation, because that narrative, that hurtful narrative, I understand religious trauma, I understand that there's a lot of hurt, but I also understand that the pagan community does itself its own disservice by focusing on things such as the burning times, such as the Inquisition, and clinging to things that you can go back 5 generations and they weren't even born during those times. I'm not saying forget those times, they're a good lesson to remember, but to victimize yourself in order for you to strengthen yourself is not a way to strengthen yourself. The way to strengthen yourself is acknowledging your trauma with the help of others, which myself and other people in the pagan community, especially clergy in your own faith tradition, will be happy to sit down with you with. But we need to move past that, and I'm sorry, let me correct myself. We need to move with it in a healthy manner that allows us to actually enjoy living a religious life. We have to enjoy being pagan, as opposed to a pagan running around saying, oh, Christian did this, Christian said that. Same thing as how Christians need to be living in a healthy Christian way without running with signs saying burn the pagan. So all those things are a lot of things that we internalize, and sometimes that is, you should go hand in hand with professional therapy, which I am not a psychotherapist, so I can't do anything about it. But I'm as pagan clergy, I have to also forward you to healthy and proper resources so we can have a healthy generation. Because nowadays, up until this point, there are very few pagans, if any, that were born into the faith. We are all apostates of our former religion, for the most part. For the most part. But now we're seeing an increase of pagans being born into a pagan tradition. So now we have to ask ourselves, how are we raising the next generation? So I do want to thank you for being, for kind of echoing some of the sentiment that I've espoused and others have as well.
That's good. I'm going to go with a quick, this should be, oh, hold on, we've got a question from the audience, go ahead. Yes, please.
My question has, Ethan, you talked about, paganism is Norse and heathenism is Germanic. So my question has to do with how does those traditions understand things like diversity and equity and inclusion when it's kind of based in a sort of mono-ethnicity?
So you're asking, how does heathenry, okay, how does following a tradition like heathenry, how does that work with, or can it work with the notions of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Okay.
Okay.
Yes, that should be easy for you, Ethan, go ahead.
As a former Jew, so a lot of people they have that romanticized notion of antiquity. And in paganism, and in many pagan traditions, not just heathenry, there is a romanticized version of the past, of what things may have been like or whatnot. And it's contrary to a lot of the things that we find. So in heathenry, it's one of those reconstructionist traditions that rely upon a foundation that is based off of the findings found in archaeology, philology, linguistics, because we don't have a sacred book of divine law, we do not have a central authority. So that gives us these little pieces of information from which we try to kind of erect our spiritual house. One of the things that I really stress when talking to heathens, either ones who are coming in or people who are curious, is we're not Vikings. We don't live in the 10th century. We live in the 21st century. So with that, the idea of equity and inclusion is something that we have to make a conscious effort to provide and add. There is evidence in the record of, you think of Vikings, you think of like masculine, warrior men. There are plenty of evidence that recently surfaced that pisses a lot of people off, but whatever, of women warriors, joining these raids or whatnot. So the idea of this like super uber macho masculine man or whatever is romanticized, and it's incorrect. And so but even if it was, let's assume that heathens of antiquity were a monolithic culture steeped in like toxic masculinity and patriarchy.
The golden age.
So what? The golden age, yeah, sure. Like, so what? We're not living in those times, but because we're Reconstructionists, because we're in a Reconstructionist tradition, we have the option, just as much as racist heathens have the option to add a genetic caveat for membership, something that Gerald Gardell in his book Gods of the Blood called the biologization of spirituality. Matthias, why did I say Gerald? Matthias Gardell coined the biologization of spirituality. Just because that is added into the 21st century also means that you can be inclusive, that you can accommodate men, women, trans folk, and there are a lot of interpretation, and we were talking in your panel about the idea of certain myths and legendary that have many different facets, and we're able to then take these narratives of antiquity and look at them from an inclusive lens and find out these liminal mythical figures that present a powerful archetype for trans folk or a powerful archetype for women, which by the way had a lot more rights in heathen antiquity than they do today. So basically the bottom line is that because we're able to reconstruct things today, means that we are able to take the building blocks of today and create a healthy and hopefully wholesome religious tradition.
Oh, yes, over here.
I'm sorry, I believe you had
Is there a hand?
Did you have your hand raised earlier?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, and I completely cannot see you.
If you're,
That's okay.
if you're by the column, please like.
Yeah, please. Yes. So then you.
I'm currently studying interfaith engagement, but my schooling has mostly been within monotheistic traditions. And so my question would be, going forward, what can I do to make pagans feel safe and included and heard within interfaith spaces?
Oh, good one.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I thought about taking that one. Yeah.
Repeat the question, please.
Honestly, yeah, right. How do we make polytheists feel more comfortable, right? Well, from experience, we can marry them, I guess. That is to do their weddings. Yeah, we can. That works for me. I guess for Ethan. That's a really important question. We, I think, just need to, for Christians, right? The thing that I try to keep in mind, and so many of us as Christians fail on it, is keep in mind how inclusive Jesus was thoroughly in the Bible. And we have been contradicting that left and right for centuries upon centuries. And so to remember to open our minds and hearts and doors and to check those prejudices at the door. I just want to say, to twist that into something I really want to say, is that I have experienced radical hospitality from the pagan community here on a level that I rarely see in Christian churches. And that is honest to goodness truth. And I'm just grateful for the welcome that I've had here. because I think I've hung around with far more pagans this week than I have with other Christians. And I would just, I want to lift up, somewhat ironically, the fact that I think it's really important for people to know, and this is something I realized right off the bat, as we were preparing your wedding, and Kristen and Ethan did an incredible job as a Christian and a pagan putting together a wedding ceremony that really brought together both traditions in ways that had incredibly powerful intersections. And so much of it was about community and family. And just to recognize, I don't know how much this helps, but for anybody, especially not familiar with paganism or with polytheism in general, your tradition is so zeroed into community. And so often, sadly, we have failed as Christians, especially, in power. That imperialism thing has echoes still today, right? We have failed to be inclusive like Jesus has been. And we have failed to give the welcome that honestly, I really feel like pagans have largely succeeded at more than we have these days. So I'm right now at a deficit of just needing to be able to reflect the hospitality that I've seen from the pagan community and not seeing in my own church sometimes. And we're really seriously working on that. And thank you, folks. Those of you who are pagan, polytheist, you've really shown me how we can set the bar. You have set the bar, and we can do better.
I also want to make sure I mentioned the betrothal table again. You can go up there and find out about inclusive heathenry. Okay, that's a good thing there. But the other main thing I'm going to say is that keep asking questions and honestly listen for that. And instead of listening to respond, just keep asking questions. And both, I'm going to say both. Every person in every tradition needs to also be willing to fail miserably at it. And be gracious about that, and hope that the person on the other side receiving that can appreciate the gesture, knowing that they're going to fail at some point too, where we will all fail upwards together and make this better, okay? Now, show me those hands back there again, with two hands. Okay, great. No, I want to come back over here. I just want to see the other hand before I did that. So there's one here, Carl, and then here. Okay, great. But you were next. I use Star Trek episodes.
I'm not kidding. Y'all can laugh, but Brian's exegesis on Star Trek is incredible. So talk to him after the panel. Bring up any Star Trek episode, he will just talk. So I'm gonna start answering this by letting you know that a few months ago I went to my sister's wedding in DC, and I took a trip. I walked through the Museum of the Bible. Great museum, relatively new. Price point of $30. I'd say it's worth it, but it is also surprisingly enough, for a sacred book of divine law, there are a lot of frickin' versions. And especially if you look at the Ethiopic Bible written in Amharic, it has at least 25 additional books that no other version of the Bible has. So with respect to a sacred book of divine law, it's one of those things where we've got a specified tradition. When it comes to heathenry, as I mentioned before, we as a Reconstructionist faith, we focus a lot on things that were found in archaeology and linguistics and whatnot. And our myths are the myths that we know today is Norse mythology. A lot of them come, at least in the Scandinavian realm of Germanic paganism, come from the Eddas. And the Eddas were written by Snorri Sturluson back in the 10th century. He was a Christian chieftain in Iceland. But despite him being a Christian, a lot of study about the Eddas have found that they were compiled from extant sources that are now lost. the idea of scripture, or the idea of a holy book, is something that is relatively new in terms of world religion. And there's different ways of approaching a holy book. You know, in Christianity or in Judaism, especially in Christianity, when you're thinking it's the infallible word of God, that's one thing. If you speak to the Sikhs, they have the Guru Granth Sahib, which is an actual, it's not even a representation of God, it is God in the room. And that makes that a really different approach, and so if we go on the other end of the spectrum with heathenry or paganism, a lot of these traditions were an oral tradition. And because of the history of the rise of Christianity and either forced or willing, a lot of it has been willing conversions in history, that oral tradition started dying off. And what you see happen is it becomes more subversive, and it becomes more folklore and storytelling. So a lot of the things that you hear about, like for instance, we were talking about the story of Snow White. If you read some of the original Germanic Snow White, it does not end as pretty as Disney. But a lot of them also teach these very deep moral lessons, and that is kind of one of the things that heathenry and other pagan traditions cling to. Are the teachings. The Bible, for instance, is no different in the sense of, like, you can ask, depending on the Christian, and Andy, maybe you can chime in on this, is what's more important? Is it the Word of God, or is it the parables and the stories that are being told that really matter? Someone once told me also, like, what's the difference between Jesus and Buddha to Christians and Buddhists? And Christians would say it's the man. Buddhists would say it's the teachings of the Buddha. And so it really depends on what you're really focusing on. And in heathenry, it would be a lot of the essence of the narrative itself, as opposed to whether the narrative is holy or not.
There's a Zen story where a missionary was reading off different parts of Jesus' story to a Buddhist guru, and after every passage, the Buddhist would just say, that person is very close to Buddhahood. That is beautiful, very close to Buddhahood. So it's over here on the hand. I can't see the hand. Yes, is that you? Yes, please.
Hi. Okay. Hi.
Hello.
I guess I have a question, primarily for Andy, maybe, but for anyone who would like to answer. So I'm guessing, what I'm wondering is, do you think Christianity can kind of move past this, like, sort of us versus them mentality?
Were you reading my notes? Good grief, people! You're taking all my questions now.
For instance, like, throughout the world, like when Christian missionaries have come to various parts of the world, the idea of Jesus is not world-shattering to a polytheist who already believes in so many deities that why not just include one more? But that's not good enough for the Christian missionaries. They need to abandon all of their gods and only believe in Jesus. So I guess for that, like, the worldviews are just so different. When you're in a monotheistic frame of mind, do you think it's possible for those monotheists to truly understand that there is the potential for more than just like a one version of God to exist in a way that is like real and meaningful to people in the world?
I knew I was going to say yes. Thank you.
I'm glad you took it to you.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. It's fascinating because the text that we keep going to each time we do this from the Bible that has most pertinence to the circumstances, I think, is in the 17th chapter of the New Testament book of Acts, where Paul the Apostle, who by the way went from persecutor to persecuted, much like the church has unfortunately gone from persecuted to persecutor. We've done the reverse Paul to Saul. In one of his finer moments, Paul is speaking at the Areopagus, the Mars Hill in Athens, and points to the altar to an unknown God in the midst of the pagan culture there, and says, well, here's the one God you don't know. It's Jesus. It's the Christian concept of God. It is, I think, so hardwired, to be honest, in so many Christians, the idea that there can only be one God, which is really interesting because we also have a triune God, right? We've got a plurality within the one God, which is, I think, so important. And I was just thinking this morning about how, it's not that much of a stretch, as much as I think it's been taught to us that people can't have more than one God. But we do have one God. Christians have one God. I don't want to dispute that. But I mean, sometimes we pray to, God the Father. Sometimes we pray to Jesus. I do that especially with little kids because sometimes it's more approachable to just talk to Jesus. Sometimes we call upon the Holy Spirit. There are aspects of God, and I think there is definitely beauty in the plurality, and Christians miss that on so many levels, and we're doing that in society in ways that I think many of us are thankfully finally starting to come to terms with, but even within the monotheistic Christian God's self, right, there's a plurality, and that is, I think, really important. I don't know how to completely answer that because it is still, I think, so hardwired for so many Christians, again, thinking conversion rather than conversation, that we have to get people to believe in not only one God, but this God, right? And then we just, again, have the goal in mind and we fail to listen in the meantime. So I hope that helps.
The feminine in God, she was saying.
What's that?
She's saying also the feminine in God.
Exactly, right, and yes, really interesting. I one time brought into a children's sermon, had no idea what I was getting myself into talking about the feminine imagery of God, and especially the Old Testament, and boy, some people did not like that, but it's there, it's definitely there.
It sounds a little bit like you're talking about becoming more comfortable with the uncertainty of divinity as opposed to being certain that this is what divinity is. There's only one definition for it.
Right.
Trying to embrace what I like to call a more entropic version of divinity.
No, that's great, and thank you for that restatement. And the other thing that keeps popping into my head here lately is that, as the dominant religion in the United States, at least, Christians have been so focused on, doing what's right or being right, and we're then thereby ignoring, human beings' rights, and that is totally the wrong way to be right.
Carl, I believe, was next.
So, unfortunately, you prompted this twofer question with your comments about hospitality. Ethan, do you think that paganism has become so focused and has held hospitality as so high because paganism has become such a safe space for marginalized communities in response to, especially within heathenry, of the extremists using it for the exact opposite purpose, as we have become more hospitable as they have become more hostile? And Pastor Andy, do you think that the reverse is going to happen in Christianity? As more progressive Christians become more welcoming, they will become more actively hospitable?
I'm going to let Andy go first because this was his first parliament and his first experience in Langar, so he can get a chance to really understand what hospitality is.
The Langar blew my mind. Unbelievable, especially as we've been focusing. We just got a miserable result in a survey that we had our congregation do in how we thought we were being really hospitable, and boy we aren't, and boy the Langar on the other hand. Incredible experience of hospitality. I would really like to think that the more we recognize the religious plurality in the world, the more Christianity would be able to experience and exhibit more hospitality. Because yes, this is one of the things from the get-go, from your rehearsal dinner, not even the wedding yet, the day before, just recognizing the pagan folks who were there, just how safe they found that to be, and unfortunately Christianity had created a completely different experience which largely led them down that path.
I'm going to say this quick because I know that we're coming close to conclusion. But I do agree that a lot of the hospitality that heathenry and paganism in general has largely exhibited is because of the fact that we're not just welcoming marginalized communities, especially LGBTQ folk, but we are shaped by them. A lot of the founders of our faith traditions and certain spiritual paths and organizations and initiatives of the pagan community have been orchestrated and spearheaded by marginalized folks. So.
All right. I know there were some other questions, but I'm gonna end with this one as our wrap up, so we can clean up because there's another group coming in. But this is the one I wanted to end on. So, a religion is largely created, or at least sustained, by those who practice it. So, how does this dialogue contribute to creating and sustaining your tradition?
I think conversations like this one, I'm not going to put ourselves on a pedestal, but I would at least hope that it would make us as Christians relevant to the world around us and recognize that we can't carry out the patterns we've been in, especially the harmful ones, but even the ones that are just going through the cycle. And these sort of conversations are holy things that we experience divinity in.
I'm not going to follow that. That went well.
Yes, thank you very much. We're going to close this out. If you had a question you couldn't answer and you couldn't ask it, please visit us out in the hallway. We're going to clean this up.